Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back after a little bit of a pause to the Uncoder on Unqork's Twitch channel. I hope everyone had a great Thanksgiving. That was part of our delay or our time off here. And then also last week, Unqork was representing itself at AWS reInvent. So one of, if not now, maybe the biggest tech conferences in the world, happening in Las Vegas, all over Vegas, actually. It's pretty wild when you land, even in the airport, all the advertisements have turned to tech, and down the whole strip, all the billboards and the advertisements are tech. It's kind of weird because you don't typically think about security companies and logging companies and monitoring companies and stuff like that when you think of Vegas. But that's all it was. So kind of just AWS taking over Vegas for a week. And Unqork was there. You could see our booth in the background. The first codeless platform for the enterprise. Got a lot of great attention, had a lot of great conversation with a lot of really interesting and interested people coming up to our booth to learn more about what it means to be the first codeless platform. So I figured today, now coming back off of a week in Vegas, which everyone should know that's a lot, but we survived. But figure we want to talk about AWS a little bit, and Unqork, of course, in AWS. And we're going to talk about how, with some recent features added to the platform, we're really starting to unlock our creators' ability to do more with AWS, because the majority of our customers, not all, but a majority of them, do choose AWS as their hosting platform of choice, their cloud platform of choice, right? And they get a very secure environment managed by Unqork through AWS. Right. But a lot of our customers, a lot of people, anyone, they have AWS accounts of their own, right? They have other systems and other, usages of AWS products and services in their own world. And now we're really opening up possibilities for them to go ahead and start to leverage those services and those products a lot more directly through Unqork, and just doing it all in a codeless manner. So that's going to be the focus. Going to be focusing on services, something called custom authentication, which I'll talk about, and then how that can unlock a lot of great stuff with AWS. So with that said, I'm going to get Sharon here. All right, cool. Should be up, right? So first thing, before I go into the custom authentication, I want to just talk about GraphQL for a quick second. So GraphQL started in Facebook, actually, and probably the graph, the social graph. That was that big thing that they were building, where you can, find way too much information about way too many people through it. But effectively, to solve a lot of their problems, they came up with this new approach to building APIs, right? Where they're calling it apparently a query language for your API. So it's not your standard REST methods, and it's not your standard, like, this is exactly what you send me and this is exactly what you're going to get back. It's a lot more flexible in terms of what you want to ask for of an API and what you want to get back from an API, right? So it says the API provider itself can really, really describe their data, the objects and the things within inside of it. You then, as an end user, can ask for exactly what you want from that API, which then you're going to get back, right? You can even do things like combine many resources in a single request, right? So maybe, I think one of the example here was like, you want to get the hero. I want to asking for the hero and their name and their friends, right? So I got Luke Skywalker and then his friends of all those people, right? So of course, the example there is like friends related, because again, kind of starting with Facebook and their social graph. But now, if there's, if you think about relational or even not in a relational manner, just like, relationships between data, you can now query back, specific parts of data you want. So the reason I'm even bringing up GraphQL, and you can obviously go to graphql.org to learn a lot more about it, is because Unqork is opening up a lot more of their services through GraphQL, and building a lot more of APIs that the platform exposes via GraphQL. Okay. And one of those APIs is the foundation for the rest of this talk, which is the custom authentication API, okay, or the authenticators API. So what I have here is the GraphQL playground up and running. This exists in every Unqork environment. You can play around with our GraphQL endpoints, and you can get information about all the different things that we're now adding into our GraphQL library in the docs over here. Of course, so long as you're authenticated. All right. And then in this example, what I'm doing here is I'm getting back my authenticators. Okay. So I'm asking for, this happens to be the path. I want to get the authenticators, and this is the information that I want back about. All right. Just to like kind of demonstrate the GraphQL there, if I remove version and I rerun this, the version goes away, right? So that's the whole idea, that you get what you ask for and nothing more. So you can have as big or as small of a payload as you may want, versus the API again telling me I'm going to give you everything about this authenticator. And then you get it back regardless, right? But I guess I'm jumping too far ahead, because like, what is an authenticator, okay? And why is there an endpoint here where you see AWS signature 4 kind of twice? Really, this is the one we're going to focus on, the one over here, right? So what is an authenticator? And then I'll show you why how I create an authenticator. So if we jump over into Unqork Services Administration for a second, you'll see down in this type of authentication, we have a number of out-of-the-box, very common, predictable, industry standard authentication protocols, right? And most APIs out there in the world are going to adhere to these general authentication types, right? But that's not always the case. And in fact, in the case of AWS, that's not the case. They decided to roll their own authentication, which is not, necessarily just a simple OAuth client credentials grant or something, right? So if we want to, think about a world where we want to deal with a world where you're going to run into a service that doesn't maybe confine or adhere to, a standard industry protocol, how do we go about unlocking that integration in Unqork? Well, one thing we can do is we could just continue to add in things like Canada Post and Google Places and Hyperscience, right? These are plaid. These are non-standard authentications that, Unqork's original approach to solving that was to, build it as a new authentication type, right? Because when I choose the authentication type that I want, I'm going to see the data that I need to collect about that authentication type. And then there's going to be certain steps that the system needs to go through using those authentication details to authenticate to the API. So we could have just continued to go and add more and more custom types as we went. But we're not. We're going to allow our users to define these. And instead of focusing on, again, kind of just poking holes in terms of where people need us to build an authentication type, let's give them the opportunity. So over here now, you actually see two authentication types at the bottom: AWS Signature 4 Dynamic Host, AWS Signature 4, which happen to align to the two authenticators that I got my GraphQL endpoint of authenticators. Okay. Now, how did I create these authenticators, and what does it even mean to do that? So now, actually, let me jump over here. If I choose AWS Signature 4, you're going to see some new fields appear here. They're actually going to appear slightly differently, which is a good, which works for this demonstration purposes, right? And they're going to be in two columns. Whereas if I go back up here, it doesn't look like that, right? So these are dynamically generated properties that are necessary to authenticate to the AWS Signature 4 authentication type and to talk to the world of AWS APIs that they've exposed, right? So how did these get in there, first and foremost? So for that, let me just actually jump over to VS Code. So this is the authenticator JSON, right? Because everything that you do in Unqork is just JSON, okay? So we have a new format, a JSON format, a JSON document that allows you to describe for a given authentication type what fields are necessary to make the authentication work, right? So those are my inputs. So you can see here in this JSON document, these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fields that are defined are the 5 fields that I now need to provide to the Unqork Service Administration page when defining an AWS service. Okay, so great. Now I've got the data. What on earth do I do next, right? Well, that's where you can start to define the steps, right? And the steps is actually telling Unqork what to do in order to, successfully make this request. And let me tell you, it's not really easy for Signature 4. Okay, but we've got that one for you, and you'll find your way through the other ones, right? So this is it saying, okay, the first thing we want to do is we want to format the current date, right? Because that's a part of the signature for Sig4 is a formatted version of the current date. Right. And then we want to do, and now they have this thing called AMZ date. So we're going to do another version of the date, right? So there's a few different date transformations, and so on and so on and so on. And I won't go step by step here. You don't really need to know exactly how the AWS Signature 4 works in this. But the idea is, regardless of what the steps are, you can now define them, and then they'll be followed when it's time to make that connection to that service. Right. So what I did with this JSON, in order to create that authenticator from this JSON, it was a call to our GraphQL endpoint where I just post that JSON basically into the upload authenticator. I'm not going to hit, this is obviously I've timed out. I'm not going to hit submit here because I don't want another one created because I already have it. But that's it now, right? So via API, you can create via JSON to API to GraphQL API. You can build new authenticators that you can then use, right? So now we have AWS Signature 4 available for us to start configuring against AWS services. So with that being said, what are some of the examples that we can do with AWS and looking at it? So you see I've got a few open here. I've got Lambda, I've got SQS, started to play around a little with SNS, and then S3. So let's start with S3 because that's probably one that's pretty familiar to people, right? So what we'll be doing as we continue to deepen this integration and this partnership with AWS is effectively what I'm calling like the codeless SDK for AWS. So if you go, if I look, where could it be? All these tabs open related to it. So so here's our guides. Here's the AWS JavaScript SDK, right? So these are the methods in JavaScript that you would call to invoke any of the various, basically, which just kind of front door the APIs. It's just a convenience effectively for you to be talking to the underlying APIs, and it handles the Sig4 authentication for you. That's kind of like the biggest thing that the SDK does, in my opinion, is it just kind of creates the interaction with the API, and then it exposes it nicely, right? So we want to have the same thing because we don't want you writing JavaScript if you don't have to. We want you doing things codelessly. So we'll be creating the codeless SDK for AWS. Right. And you can see a few examples of it here. So you can start with like a list buckets example. Let's just look at the list buckets. It's just an API module inside of Unqork, right? Which effectively says, hey, this is going to be, and I'll pop open the documentation for it. And what does it say? It says you could get the list and it's going to give you back the buckets, right? Again, this is just us front dooring the API. So what do? We just come in here. We've used the AWS S3 service. And if I hop back over to my custom auth, you can see down at the bottom, I have Lambda, S3, and SQS. Now I'm not going to click them because there's API keys because the access key is public, but I don't want to make it that public. The secret, of course, is secret. But we have 3 services here because part of that signature is the service that you want to use. And the URLs are always different. Like it'll be s3.amazonaws.com or lambda.amazon. So you can get kind of dynamic and fancy with the authenticator, but I felt it was clear to just say, hey, you might want 3 different services because you might have 3 different access keys, so on and so on and so on. You might not be permissioning your S3 IAM user to be talking to your Lambda. So if we just created one AWS, you might run into permissioning. So we'll break it out. So we have 3 separate services here, all using that custom authenticator of AWS. So coming back over here, so that's all it does, right? It just talks to S3 and it just does a GET request. It knows, obviously, even though this isn't an Unqork specific URL, so I'm not necessarily talking directly to my URL for it. It knows, of course, who I am, and therefore it can find the right buckets for me, right? So here's the effective. That's all you need. And then, AWS, for some reason, unbeknownst to me, still has a lot of their APIs as XML. which again surprises me. But hey, so we built as part of this, there'll also be an XML to JSON conversion. So you don't need to do that because we know that you're going to want to work in JSON. And of course, that's another thing. Let's say that SDK does, it's going to give it back to you in a JavaScript object, not even JSON, a JavaScript object versus XML, right? So we're going to do that for you as well. And we're going to map it out, and we're going to grab that XML and set it up for you. And just to show what that even looks like for folks who are interested, because it's actually one fun little parameter I want to show you. So Unqork has a convert XML to JSON endpoint. It's available in the internal services dropdown. You can use it anytime you need to convert XML to JSON. And if you do that, I just encourage you to pass this parameter in. Now, for folks who are not familiar with Unqork, this doesn't make sense to you, but for those who do, if you've ever had to transform XML to JSON, pass in false for options.explicit array. And this is in the documentation of the API. You'll see if I go learn more here, it'll pop up my API docs for this method. You'll see that it says the options to pass to the XML to JS library. Well, we have a dead link. Hope someone on the support team is watching right now. But this should, I open it in a new tab, I'm good to go, right? So this is the underlying library that the XML to JSON conversion uses. So when it says, hey, well, what do you mean by options? You can see what those options are here. And I found that when you pass explicit array as false, you don't get, it's just a nicer structure. So I promise you, if you're doing any of these conversions, you want it, and you look at the response you get back from the conversion with and without it, because the default is true. So if you don't include it, it'll look different. It's way better without explicit array, in my humble opinion. Okay, so we do that for you, right? So now you're going to get back a nice clean JSON object of your buckets. Similarly to list objects, the list objects, it expects you to tell it what bucket you want, and it's going to do the same thing, right? It's going to go and it's going to get the specific bucket, and it's going to give you back the results. So what's something we can do with this, right? So this is just a little like playground module I have here to kind of mess around with it. So let's think about building like a file system, right? So like actually, if I jump back into the Unqork admin screen here for a second, and I go to managed assets, right? This is obviously, it's a nice upload and create folder and navigate through folders and stuff like that, right? So Unqork has this, which actually talks to S3 on our managed, as indicated by the name, our managed S3 for our customers. But if you want to talk to your own S3, you could even think about building your own, using our grid components, build your own kind of like file browser. And I haven't really completed it, so it's not going to look as sexy as possible, right? But here is taking the result of a buckets call and throwing that into a grid. Now I'll hit the codeless bucket, and it's going to tell me what's inside that bucket, right? And I've got to do some work here to group things by the path, so then I can hit assets, which then shows me CSS and image. So we can do that, right? Now you can build a new front door for people. So maybe you don't want, because like of course, Amazon's got this, right? I won't go into my backend for it, but Amazon has this, but you're not going to be giving all your users access directly to, the S3 console. So you want to expose another front door into your external S3 that isn't done within Unqork using our grids and now the codeless SDK we'll be building for Unqork. You can start to do that and allow people to upload files extremely securely, right? So that's S3. Let's show you some other ones, okay? So how about Lambda? So I don't know if folks are familiar with Lambda, but Lambda basically is our serverless function. So when we talk about serverless, that's what it is, right? It's you just write some code and Amazon AWS does the rest for you. Anytime someone wants to execute this code, their responsibility to run the servers and scale it and so on and so forth. And it's become a huge part of a lot of architectures. So we want people to be able to leverage serverless functions inside of Unqork, right? So same concept here. Let's just take a look at a list functions endpoint, right? Where it's going to list me out. It's just going to get back the functions that I'm using within Unqork, or the functions I have within my AWS instance. And then I can even invoke those functions. right? Actually make a call with a payload, saying whether or not it's asynchronous, even, and make that call to AWS here. So if I pop that one open, right, it's going to make a call to the function and it's going to pass my payload in. And then it also has a header saying whether or not it's supposed to be asynchronous or not, right? So you don't need to worry about where you got to put the header. You just give us a payload, you give us a function, you give us a true false on that async. We'll make the asynchronous call for you, right? So let me pop open. So I've got, the playground per, SDK. I'm doing a few things, setting tags, but really I think the only things when I pop this module open, I'm going to list the functions. I'm going to invoke it twice, right? So my first invocation of it, I'm going to say, all right, I'm going to invoke this function and I'm just going to give it this payload, right? Because this thing says, hey, give me event, 1, 2, key 1, 2, 3. All right. And then, but the second one, I'm going to say, I want to run it async. I'm going to do the same thing and invoke the same function, but I'm going to do it asynchronously. All right, now let's go look at how that comes out in the front end when I preview this module. Pop my network open real fast. Boom, boom, boom. All right, we got them. So first and foremost, here's our list of functions, right? So all we got is that I just started with a hello world one. So that's the first one. That's the function that I'm invoking. So here's our list of functions, right? Again, I think translated from XML to JSON. And now look, we got two more. And this is invocation number 1, where I said, don't execute it asynchronously, just give me back the response and wait for the response. And there it is. It just told me back A because, right, that's what this thing did. It returned the first key value. Again, this is the most basic hello world. It came right out of like a blueprint that you can choose when you're creating functions in Lambda. But there it is. It just returns back to me the key. So in my first call, it gave me back A. But in my second call, actually gave me back no payload. Right? And if I look at the header, it gave me back a 202, right? Because that said, hey, I don't want you to, don't wait for the response. And let's see, it might have been, it's a little bit faster, right? Because it said, don't wait for a response. Don't wait for this code to actually do anything. Just call the function and you're done, right? So that's all that happened here is we just made a call out to this function and then we continued on our merry way, right? So you can leverage these serverless functions now within Unqork synchronously, asynchronously, however you want, and really expand the integration possibilities through your Lambda functions. All right. Cool. And one last one for you then will be SQS. Okay, so SQS is simple queue service, right? It's a messaging service. So this basically allows a number of different systems to push messages into a queue so that other systems can pick up on it. So why do queues matter? And SNS is a little bit similar, right? That's a simple notification service where it's a similar concept though. Like different systems are pushing information to a centralized place, and then others can come and pull that in. And you might hear it as like pub sub and things like that, or message queues or streaming. If you haven't heard of SQS, maybe you've heard of Kafka. If you've heard of Kafka, maybe now you haven't heard of SQS. Simple notification. They're basically a way to really decouple your systems, right? Because as more and more people are building more and more distributed systems and they have, multiple microservices, multiple applications, all working in harmony to deliver an end user application, dependencies can get very difficult. If one system always has to talk directly to another system, that can become complicated because one system's problem can negatively impact another system. Things can get lost. So this idea of queuing, it's a centralized way for all systems to kind of talk to one another, right? You push messages into a queue when something happens in your system, and then the other system picks it up if it's relevant to them. So let's say an example could be I'm checking out, on an e-commerce website, right? I plug in my information and I hit submit rather than the checkout application talking directly to the payment application. The checkout application might push that information to a queue and then the payment application will pick it up. Like that's probably something that's real time enough that maybe it isn't done in messaging, but the idea is that's kind of the idea. And then if something fails, the message is still in the queue and can be picked up later. It's also a great way to say, hey, we want to record these events, but we don't care when they actually get processed. So let's just get them in there, and then some other system can kind of take its time going through as it sees fit. All right, so let's see what that could look like via API again. So I'll open up my little sandbox here, and I'm just doing a plug queue, and then I'm going to send a message, I'm going to receive a message. Right. So of course, if I look back at the SDK APIs, they're pretty straightforward. It says, hey, hey, just go get me the queues. Right. That's all I need to do. Okay. And if I want to send a message, similarly, I got to encode it, but then it's just going to send the message. Right. So we're just going to send messages, and let's look at that on the front end. So list queues, all I'm doing is I'm saying, hey, I want to list queues. And then if I want to send a message, I'm actually just going to throw in a queue, and I'm going to send that message. Right. I'm going to send a very simple message here of just Unqork, but like maybe since we're almost up on time, but we got a few minutes. Let's maybe try to tweak this. All right. So if I preview it, and since I was late on my network tab, let me open it up again. And you'll see I am getting back a list of my queues. I'm actually writing, in this case, I'm writing the word Unqork to my queue. And in this, I'm getting back messages. And actually, I got back the Unqork message. Right now, I think this is a test from before, because these two fired off like at the exact same time. So I can't imagine this one really got in fast enough. But I did, post an Unqork message earlier. But now I wrote a message to the queue, and I got that message back. So let's actually look at that for a second. If I look at the message response, message result, let's look at the message ID here. Actually, no, let's go look at the send message result. Let's grab this message ID. All right, I'm going to grab that. I'm going to keep that handy for a second. I'll just pop it back over here. Don't forget it, right? And let's actually refresh the page. Let's see if we get that message that we sent the first time if we refresh. Send message result, attribute, body, message ID. Now we haven't got the new one back yet. Oh, because I think I'm only defining getting one message back at a time. So I'm only getting the most recent message, which is this one, which hasn't been removed from the queue yet. So I'm just getting the same first message over and over and over again. But that's the point, is like, you're going to get a message. You choose to handle the message until you've said, hey, this message has been received and handled, like delete a message. Until you actually say, hey, this message is good, it's going to give you back that message so that you have that kind of redundancy between your systems. So I know I said I was going to maybe like tweak a little bit of stuff there, but since we're exactly at 4:30, I think I'm going to pause it on that note and let y'all go on your merry way. I know it's getting late on a Thursday. It's also December. A lot of people are very busy with holiday stuff, so I don't want to take you I don't want to take you away from your holiday plans and whatever you might have going on. But I'm glad to be back. I hope this was fun. AWS reInvent, check out their website, check out some of their product launches. I was spending my whole time at the booth showing people the power of the first codeless platform. So I didn't get to really learn a lot, but I definitely read about some of the great product announcements that came. And I assure you, we're going to be looking how we can tie those even better into Unqork using something like custom authentication. So thanks as always for joining. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Have a great weekend, and we'll catch you next time.